Even as the situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts continues to deteriorate for Kiev, and we'll come to that shortly, the Zaluzhny-Zelensky saga continues unabated, with each man writing, or rather engaging with the media, giving, well, in Zaluzhny's case, writing a long article, and in Zelensky's case, giving an interview, which clearly aim at the other. Zaluzhny's interview, I believe from recollection in CNN, was a long piece dealing essentially with very abstract questions, explaining that the military situation was such today that a major technological enhancement was needed in order to achieve victory, kind of thing which really doesn't tell us anything about the actual situation in the war. But Zaluzhny then followed up with a few swipes at Zelensky, saying that the political leadership was failing the army by not pressing forward to keep the army supplied with the men and resources that it needs in order to continue the war. It was a very thinly disguised attack on Zelensky, who Zaluzhny is trying to set up for blame for the fact that Ukraine has still not enacted a mobilization law, despite this being now under discussion for several months. Anyway, even as Zaluzhny is writing and posting photographs of himself with one of the leaders of right sector, with a picture of Stepan Bandera in the background, reminding everybody of the fact that the nationalist wing of the Ukrainian political system backs him. Zelensky was giving his own interview to the Italian media, and again, he didn't refer to Zaluzhny specifically, but he said that a huge reorganization of the Ukrainian government and military and political structures should soon be underway. Many people would be sacked. Again, as I said, he didn't specifically identify Zaluzhny, but to me, I have to say, it looked like a typical Zelenskyan retreat into grandiosity, trying to cover the fact that a week after the reports that Zaluzhny had been dismissed started to appear in the media and on Ukrainian telegram channels, despite all of that, Zaluzhny remains in place. Supposedly, it's not about Zaluzhny specifically, but about some great reorganization that's going to happen, which is going to change the entire direction of the war. So, an abstract discussion of military banalities from Zaluzhny, combined with a swipe at Zelensky for failing to implement the mobilization plan, a plan for which, by the way, Zaluzhny has studiously failed to accept any responsibility, and for which he has barely advocated. He's not really gone to the parliament, he's not appeared on Ukrainian television, he's not spoken to people, he's not explained to people why this mobilization is needed. Anyway, a swipe at Zelensky from Zaluzhny, as I said, all disguised as within an article, as I said, rehashing cliches and banalities about the need for technological innovations, and an interview by Zelensky still appearing to want to sack Zaluzhny, but covering up the fact that he has not so far been able to sack Zaluzhny by pretending that the sacking of Zaluzhny is a minor detail and should not detract from the grander picture of this great reorganization and reshuffle that he, Zelensky, the Napoleon of Kiev, supposedly has in mind. Anyway, there we go. So this dreary saga continues, and as Larry Johnson at Sonar 21 correctly said, whilst this thing continues in the way that it is, there must be a growing paralysis across the entire Ukrainian political and military system. As Larry Johnson correctly said, in a situation like this, where there is clearly a power struggle underway, the middle-ranking officers, the people who actually have to make the decisions, must be wondering which side will come out on top, and must be questioning the orders that they receive, and will be very, very worried to appear to be taking orders from whichever side in the power struggle might eventually lose. That is an iron rule of power struggles, which is why in successful regimes they are settled quickly. Anyway, there we go. As of the time of making of this video today, Zaluzhny is still in post. There's no sign of this grand reshuffle that Zelensky is talking about. There's still no word as to who might take over from Zaluzhny if he is indeed sacked. Apparently Budanov is still not keen, and apparently Syrsky not only is not keen, but there's been interviews by Western journalists with Ukrainian commanders, and they've all been saying that they don't want Syrsky. Syrsky isn't liked. Nobody wants him, apparently, which is something that Syrsky himself understands. Syrsky at least has given the impression that he is doing his job. He's visited, apparently, Kupiansk. He's met the top military leaders there. He said that more forces from Ukraine's strategic reserve need to be committed to holding the line in Kupiansk. Of course, that is exactly what the Russians want to happen. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, spoke a few days ago about the Ukrainians committing their last reserves. And here we see Syrsky anxious to make that claim of Shoigu's true. But anyway, all of that going on, and Syrsky at least going through the motions of doing his job. Zelensky has also visited the battlefronts, or so we are asked to believe. He went to Rabotino, or at least that is the claim made by his team. There's film of him meeting soldiers there. Apparently he was there to hand out decorations. It was very difficult to get any proper sense of the location. Everything happened within a tent. There's been apparently suggestions that he didn't actually go to Rabotino at all, but that he remained in Orekhov, the major strategic base that the Ukrainian army operates north of Rabotino, a couple of kilometers north of Rabotino, and that was as far as he got in terms of reaching Rabotino. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has a good analysis of this. He says that the Russians are able to have fire control over the main supply road from the north, which Zelensky would have had to use in order to reach Rabotino, that Ukrainian reinforcements can arrive at Rabotino, but not along this road, not in vehicles. They would have to march in the fields to avoid being struck by Russian FPV drones and shells, and that the march is a distance of 6 kilometers. And Dima is correctly skeptical that the president of Ukraine would be willing to take the enormous risks and engage in the colossal exertions needed to march a 6-kilometer distance, perhaps under threat of Russian fire, to reach Rabotino. Dima is one of these people who appears to think that the meeting took place in Orekhov. I'm not going to try and debate where exactly Zelensky really was, whether he was in Rabotino or Orekhov or somewhere else, a studio set in Kiev or wherever. I don't know. I wasn't with his people when he went on this trip. But again, clearly the purpose of this stunt, because that is what it was, is to show up Zaluzhny, Zelensky, the war president, the war leader, visits the men on the front lines. I said in previous programs that this can have a positive effect on soldiers' morale, and that's clearly the image that Zelensky is trying to give. He's trying to give the appearance that he's this heroic figure able to visit the men on the front lines, with something which, by contrast, General Zaluzhny rarely does. And if that, again, sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie, it's because it is. The pose as the heroic leader, leading the heroic men into battle, does indeed give something of the impression of a scene from a Hollywood movie, but perhaps that is not so surprising in Zelensky's case. Now, I will say that if he did get to Rabotino, I wonder whether the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers who are indeed fighting for this accursed village, I say cursed village because it's been fought over for so long. It was the main target of the Ukrainian offensive of the summer. The Ukrainians expected to capture it within the first day, and it took them 2 months until they claimed that they had finally captured it. I'm told that they were never able to fully secure in complete control of it, despite this being a tiny place. But anyway, put all that aside. The soldiers in Rabotino might not feel so happy about Zelensky's appearance, if only because places on the battlefronts which Zelensky has either visited or been reported as having visited have tended to fall to the Russians, or if not fall to the Russians, well, major battles are taking place there, and it is likely that they will fall very soon. So Zelensky visited Bakhmut, and so that Bakhmut would hold, and Bakhmut fell. The Russians captured Bakhmut. Zelensky allegedly has visited Avdeyevka. I discussed that on the occasion of his visit. There's a lot of predictions and claims that, Avdeyevka would also hold. But as we will see in a moment, it looks increasingly likely that Avdeyevka will soon fall. And now he's gone to Rabotino, and that might lead some Ukrainian soldiers, based on past experience, to say to themselves, this dooms Rabotino to be captured soon by the Russians. Anyway, all of this melodrama continues. The paralysis continues. It is not without importance. I come back to Larry Johnson's point about the way in which it is going to be stultifying decision-making in Kiev, and also sowing doubts amongst middle-ranking officers on the actual battlefield. And that will affect Ukraine's ability to make decisions and to respond to the ongoing events on the battlefronts. But beyond that, whoever wins this power struggle, and this power struggle will eventually be won by one side or the other, it is going to have an effect on the outcome of the war. If Zelensky wins and Zaluzhny is sacked, the military will probably be demoralized. There will be possibly growing criticism of Zelensky, especially as his term as president ends in March. He's trying to get another martial law decree passed by the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, which he is going to try to use to justify his remaining president beyond the expiry of his term in March, despite the fact that there will be no elections. Anyway, the sacking of Zaluzhny is likely to result in criticism of Zelensky in Ukrainian society and might very well cause more problems for Zelensky than it solves. Whereas, conversely, if Zelensky fails to sack Zaluzhny, then beyond a certain point, the fiction that he genuinely leads Ukraine will have disappeared, and it will be only a question of time then, or so it seems to me, before he is finally removed. For looking at this from the other side, if Zaluzhny is sacked, then he will have to decide what he is going to do. Is he going to lead the opposition to Zelensky? Is he going to push back? Is he going to align openly with President Poroshenko? Is he going to try to go abroad and do what Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's embittered and disillusioned former spokesman, is now doing, and write critical pieces about Zelensky? Is that what he's going to do? And of course, conversely, if he is not sacked, does he work perhaps with political leaders like President Poroshenko to oust Zelensky and to assume direct control? And if he does assume direct control, what does he do then? And how would the Western powers respond to the fact that Zelensky, the man that they built up as this heroic figure who is leading Ukraine to victory, how will they react in the event that something like that actually happens? There's a very interesting article by Mark Galeotti in the London Times, which appeared yesterday, which makes it fairly clear, to me at least, that there are still some people in London who would find it very difficult to accept and understand why Zelensky, who has been built up to such heroic levels, would be ousted from power at a time like this. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time on this tedious subject, but as I said, eventually this power struggle is going to be resolved, and how it is resolved and who comes out on the top in the end will matter. Meanwhile, we are getting more and more dramatic news from the battlefronts. And I'm going to begin by saying that I'm starting to think that the end point of this war might be coming closer over the horizon than I had supposed until a few days ago. Firstly, we are getting very dramatic news from Avdeyevka. I said that the Russians now appear to have consolidated their control of various streets and buildings in southern Avdeyevka. They seem to be working towards encircling the remaining Ukrainian troops in the northern part of the air defense base. And by the way, it appears to be confirmed that the Russians do control most of the air defense base. There are still Ukrainian soldiers basically trapped in the northern part of the air defense base, and that the Russians are also in the process of encircling the Cheburasha complex, which is located just to the north of it. All of which, if the Russians fully gain control of this entire territory, will bring the Russians very close to the area of Avdeyevka, known as the Citadel, the area with the high-rise buildings, which is located to the west of, on the western side of Avdeyevka. So we have the Russians in control of much of the south of Avdeyevka. They've gained control of the Tsar's hunting lodge, and they will probably soon be in control of the full control of the air defense base and the Cheburasha complex, and they will have expanded their area of control to the west. And we've also had, over the last couple of days, a cascade of reports that the Russians are now very, very close indeed to encircling the filtration plant, which is located to the east of Avdeyevka. It's a major fortified position, and it's been suggested that the Russians will either fully encircle the filtration plant, trapping the Ukrainians within it within the next couple of days, or perhaps more plausibly, the Ukrainians, who are short of men, will pull their troops out of the filtration plant and will arrange for them to retreat across the fields to central Avdeyevka and surrender the filtration plant to the Russians. So there's fairly dramatic events taking place there also. And there is also reports that the Russians have gained more control of Pervomaysky, this village to the on the southwest of Avdeyevka. It's a long village, but the Russians have gradually, methodically been capturing more bits of it every day as they push steadily to occupy this entire village, which, once it falls under their control, will leave the Russians in a strong position to launch attacks on Ukrainian positions to the northwest of Avdeyevka, potentially cutting the supply lines to Avdeyevka. Now, all of this is bad, but the really dramatic news is coming from the north of Avdeyevka. A couple of days ago, I reported the fact, which is now confirmed, that the Russians launched a major advance and have driven deep into Avdeyevka from the north, and that they seem to be expanding their territory of control in this area in northern Avdeyevka, that they're in they've reached the central part of Avdeyevka itself, and that there's only a relatively short distance that they would have to cover through, admittedly, a built-up area before they were able to divide Avdeyevka in two. Well, reports then started to pour in yesterday, and importantly, the first person who broke them was a Ukrainian commentator called Butuzov, who has been, a regular commentator on the war from the Ukrainian side, and who can be quite reliable. Anyway, Butuzov reported that the Russians had gained a whole new area of territory east of this area where the Russians had penetrated from the north, and that this was the result, this appeared to be the result of a further advance deep into Avdeyevka from the northeast and encircling some kind of area of low ground. I'm not sure whether it's a lake or a quarry. Again, difficult for me to read maps. But anyway, there's an obstacle there. But the Russians seem to have marched round it and entered Avdeyevka in that way. And then over the course of the next couple of hours, we got more reports which appear largely, though not conclusively, to confirm Butuzov's report, in the sense that it's clear that the Russians have indeed advanced into this area, but it's not yet clear how far they've gone, and if they've reached Avdeyevka itself, and if they have reached Avdeyevka, how deep inside Avdeyevka from this direction they have gone. Now, the very latest reports, and supposedly these are confirmed by sightings or claims from the Ukrainians about where they're launching FPV drone attacks, appear to suggest that the Russians have indeed entered Avdeyevka from this direction, and that they are battling to break into the center of Avdeyevka, and that the entire Ukrainian position in this part of Avdeyevka is now in crisis. And alongside all of these Russian moves, there's been a resumption of very heavy bombing by the Russians of Ukrainian positions in Avdeyevka. There's reports that the Ukrainians have tried to rush reinforcements into Avdeyevka to prevent a total collapse. There's said to be Bradley infantry fighting vehicles operating within Avdeyevka. And certainly in the past there have been pictures of tanks also operating in Avdeyevka, Ukrainian tanks, Russian tanks as well. There are tanks present on both sides. But anyway, it does look as if these Ukrainian vehicles, Bradleys, Strikers as well, the wheeled APCs that the United States also delivered, and tanks, they seem to be coming under heavy attack, both by Russian drones and by Russian bombers, Russian bombs which have been falling on them. Now, I'm not the best person to judge the direction of all of this fighting, but to me, as a person who is not familiar with war, this looks like an ongoing collapse. The Ukrainian forces that are trying to defend Avdeyevka appear to be under attack from multiple directions. Their defense is becoming increasingly disorganized, and they're subject to extremely heavy shelling and bombing by the Russians. Most people who know about these things, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, Valterson, who writes this indispensable commentary about the war on Twitter X, a Russian journalist called Marat Knaisulin, who seems to be, by the way, at least close to the front lines in this area, and is getting apparently detailed information from the soldiers, Russian soldiers. Most of them still seem to believe that this final battle for Avdeyevka still has some way to go, maybe a couple of days, perhaps longer than that. Butuzov, the Ukrainian, by contrast, comes across to me as both angry and rather panicky, wondering clearly concerned that the situation is getting completely out of control. As I said, to my inexpert eyes, when I see attacks from so many directions over a relatively small territory, with the Ukrainians trying to shuffle troops from one part of Avdeyevka to another, under a rain of bombs and artillery shells and kamikaze drones, to me, it looks like the initial stages of an eventual collapse. And perhaps, just possibly, it could be that this battle for Avdeyevka is going to end more quickly than I had imagined until yesterday, and some of these other people whom I've just mentioned appear to think. Anyway, one way or the other, the news from Avdeyevka for the Ukrainians is very bad. An operational crisis is perhaps an understatement. It looks to me like a not so slow motion collapse, if I have to be frank. But we will see what happens there. The trouble is, for Ukraine, that the news in Avdeyevka is very bad, but it doesn't appear to be better anywhere else on any other part of the front lines. Now, if we start with Kherson region, where the Ukrainians still have this bridgehead at Krinky, or at least they have some soldiers on the beach at Krinky, on the Dnieper River. There have been a lot of rumours over the last couple of days that the Ukrainians had established some sort of a bridgehead in another part of Krinky, further to the south. The military summary channel showed pictures from a Russian drone flying over this particular part of Krinky, where this bridgehead was supposed to have been established, and there was no clear signs, apparently. I mean, I'm not able to see this film. I'm not able to understand this film, but the film apparently does not show a bridgehead there. There's been some speculation that the Ukrainian soldiers are hiding in basements and that sort of thing, but there's no clear sign of a presence, a military presence, and certainly no evidence of fighting that I could see, and no sign that any attempt was being made, by the way, to shoot down the drone. I am increasingly coming round to the view that this story about the bridgehead, the second bridgehead in Krinky, is an invention. I said last week that Ukraine had provided a cascade of reports about counterattacks in the Bakhmut area, about advances in all sorts of places, about the recapture of the Tsar's hunting lodge in Avdeyevka. And all of that seemed to me intended to distract attention from the ongoing political crisis in Kiev with this power struggle between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. And I'm coming increasingly to the view that the so-called second bridgehead in Krinky is another example of this, another mirage fabricated last week by the Ukrainian media operation trying to divert attention away from the problems in Kiev. Well, whether I'm right about that or not, one person who presumably knows what the true situation in Krinky is Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region. Anyway, he's come out and said that Ukrainian military activity in Kherson region is reducing, that the Ukrainians seem to be on the defensive, that their actions are becoming more reactive, that they don't seem to be showing taking the initiative anymore. He did not mention a second bridgehead, and I find it difficult to imagine that he would have spoken in the way that he has done if such a second bridgehead did actually exist. Anyway, that's Saldo. Elsewhere, it looks as if there is a deteriorating situation for Ukrainian troops in the Marinka area. The Russians are now pushing hard around Novomykhailovka. There's been suggestions that this village is now all but encircled. Again, there's debate about whether the Ukrainians will try to cling on to this village, even if they are encircled, or whether they will withdraw their troops from this village. I come back to what I was saying previously, with uncertainty about who is in charge. It might be difficult for Ukrainian officers on the ground to make decisions that they might be eventually criticized for by whoever comes out top in the power struggle, and that might make their decisions more uncertain and more confused. Anyway, a deteriorating situation in Novomykhailovka, less news about the Russian advances towards Avdeyevka and Pobeda, but lots of reports about the Russians pushing north from Marinka towards Krasnogorovka, a well-fortified village from which the Ukrainians have regularly shelled Donetsk city, which lies, by the way, between this area, the area of the Marinka area, and Avdeyevka, the area of the battles for Avdeyevka, further north. So a bad situation for Ukraine there, but if possible, eclipsed by the news we're getting from the north. Now, for the moment at least, or at least to the extent that we know, it looks as if the Russians have put their offensive in the Bakhmut area on hold. They are clearly shelling Ukrainian positions very intensively and launching many FPV drone strikes and things like that. And it could be that they're working to clear the Ukrainians with all of this artillery and with all of these drone strikes before they launch a further advance through Bogdanovka and seek to storm Ivanivska and advance towards Chasov Yar. Or it could be, by the way, that there is much more fighting going on and that the Russians are pressing forward harder, and it's just that we are not getting the reports. But anyway, there is less news from the Bakhmut area. But there is a gathering disaster for the Ukrainians further north in the Lyman, Kupiansk areas, where, by the way, I get the sense that the fighting is very much interconnected. And I mentioned earlier in the program that General Syrsky, the ground forces commander, has rushed to this area and has met commanders there, Ukrainian commanders there, and has spoken about the need to send reinforcements in order to stabilize the situation. Whatever else this visit of Syrsky's might imply, it suggests a very bad, deteriorating situation. And it seems that the Russians are now perhaps 1.5 kilometers from an important village called, I believe, Yampol. I seem to remember that this was an important village when the Ukrainians recaptured it from the Russians during their autumn offensive in this area in September 2022. But anyway, the Russians seem to be close to recapturing it back, and the Ukrainian defenses seem to be crumbling in this area, with the Ukrainians suffering very heavy losses, and the Russians coming very close now to the Zherebets River, small river located here. Apparently the supply roads of the Ukrainians are not very good, and it's expected that once the Russians reach the Zherebets River, they'll be able to roll up the Ukrainian defences in the various small villages located on this river fairly quickly, and that will put them in a stronger position to strike further west, potentially towards Lyman, or alternatively northwards towards Kupiansk and into the area, deeper into the area of Ukraine, recaptured by Ukraine during its successful counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. But even more critical news might be coming from the area of Kupiansk. Now, this is not connected for the moment with actual information from the battlefields. We've not actually had many more reports about what's actually going on in these places in around Kupiansk. The fighting in Sinkovka apparently continues. There's reports that the Russians are enlarging their area of control to Avdeyevka, which they captured about a week ago. But there's now been a report from Forbes which says that the Russians have concentrated 40,000 troops close to Kupiansk, that they have 500 tanks in this area, which is a very powerful tank force indeed, that they have something like 600 infantry fighting vehicles, and that they have that they massively outmatch the Ukrainians in artillery. And by contrast, the Ukrainians supposedly are down to just 20,000 men. In other words, the Russians have them heavily outnumbered, and such artillery as the Ukrainians do have is catastrophically short of shells, and they don't have enough shells with which to counter the Russians. And Forbes apparently anticipates that the Russian plan, once they've taken Kupiansk, which will be their next objective, that they want to trundle on across the Oskol River, advance towards Izium, recapture Izium, perhaps move on still further west to Balakleya, recover, in other words, all the territory that they lost over the course of Ukraine's autumn counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. And there might be some grounds to think this, because President Putin of Russia is now reported to have made comments. I haven't actually seen, again, a readout of his actual comments about this, but it's been widely reported, and I think that this is true. Anyway, he's reported to have said that the Ukrainian army acted with great cruelty in the territory of Kharkiv region that they conquered. Now, by the way, I want to stress that's President Putin who says that. I don't know what information he has about this. I'm not going to get into a discussion about whether or not what President Putin says is true. The key point is he's highlighting the cruelties that the local people in this part of Kharkiv region supposedly suffered from the Ukrainians. And he's perhaps, therefore, signposting a Russian counterattack in precisely this area, intended to bring precisely this territory that the Russians lost in the autumn of 2022, back under Russian control. By the way, I said that I wouldn't get into the details of President Putin's allegations, but there was recently an article in The Guardian, which is, of course, a British newspaper, strongly supportive of Ukraine, which did highlight instances when Ukrainian soldiers had indeed carried out reprisals against civilians who they labelled as pro-Russians in territory that the Ukrainians themselves had previously recaptured. So I'm not, as I said, going against what Putin is saying. I'm simply saying that he is saying it, and we should always be careful what one party in a war says on a question like this. Anyway, there we are. So, very bad situation on the battlefronts altogether. And there are now apparently complaints, including from Butuzov, that the leadership in Kiev, and I understood him to mean both the political and the military leadership, do not know, have lost touch with the realities on the battlefield. That the situation on the battlefield is much graver than they themselves understand, and that there have been instances when senior officers, senior Ukrainian officers, anxious perhaps to protect themselves and their positions, have given rosier estimates of the situation on the battlefield than the actual situation on the battlefield warrants. That would not, by the way, surprise me at all. So a very, very bad situation on the battlefronts. And of course the Russians continue to demonstrate their ability to launch deep strikes within Ukraine. So more drone strikes apparently on the industrial city of Kryvyi Rog, of the Dnieper River, Zelensky's hometown, by the way, carried out, as I understand it, principally by Uranium-2 drones, drone strikes in all sorts of other places, and apparently continued Russian reconnaissance groups and special forces groups conducting raids deep into Ukrainian territory on the northern borders of Ukraine, where Ukraine, desperately short of men and equipment and machines, is trying, to the extent that it can, to build fortifications to hold back the Russians. So, a very, very bad picture, and even as that is happening, a political crisis in Kiev. Of course, the two are related to each other. If Ukraine's summer offensive had been a success, if the Ukrainian troops had broken through in Kherson region, they'd managed to burst out of the bridgehead in Krinky and advance and capture first Novaya Kakhovka and then Genishek and reach the borders of Crimea. If all was well, in other words, in the war, it's most unlikely we would have the political crisis in Kiev that we do. Trouble is, the crisis in Kiev is now likely to feed in to the crisis on the battlefronts and to make it worse. And because the media in the West is not, in my opinion, really conveying to the Western public how bad the military situation in Ukraine now is, I think that the extent to which there is this crisis in Kiev and the effect it's having on the situation on the battlefronts is being underestimated. I go back to that article in the London Times by Mark Galliotti. He seemed to think that the reason there is this argument underway between Zaluzhny and Zelensky is because, in effect, now that Ukraine has been saved, the Russians have been pushed back as a result of the victories achieved in 2022. Because Ukraine has been saved, despite the disappointing result of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian leaders are now allowing themselves the luxury of political infighting, and ultimately, however, President Zelensky's position continues to be secure, and there is no realistic possibility that Ukraine could go down or that the Russians could capture Kiev. Now, I don't know what the Russian plans are. I want to say that again. But I think in reality, the situation is much more dangerous for Ukraine than it was in the first few weeks of the war back in 2022. In the first few weeks of the war, the Russians were seeking a negotiated solution to the crisis in Ukraine and were negotiating with Zelensky's government. The forces that they had deployed to conduct their offensive in February and March 2022, well, there's been debate as to how large they were, but no one says that they were more than 200,000 men, which everybody now acknowledges is too few for an operation intended to occupy the whole of Ukraine. And of course, President Putin actually said at the time, in comments which he made to the president of Azerbaijan, President Aliyev, on the very first day of the military operation, that he did not intend to occupy the whole of Ukraine. And as I said in various programs that were taking place at the time, in March 2022, I didn't think at the time that the Russians were making serious efforts to capture Kiev, and I didn't think that that was really their plan. Nor were there, at that time, serious challenges to President Zelensky's authority. Now, this time, where we stand now, the Russians have 600,000 troops in Ukraine, 3 times more than they had in February, March 2022. Those troops are far more heavily equipped than they were then. The Russians have also become much more experienced in conducting war. There are no negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians to cloud the issue. The Russians are not taking the initiative to find a political settlement to the crisis in Ukraine. And I think, as we can see from this crisis with General Zaluzhny, Zelensky's position in reality is far more brittle. So I take the diametrically opposite view to Mark Galeotti. I think the situation for Ukraine now is far more dangerous than it was in 2022. And anybody who sees this power struggle in Kiev as merely a matter of indulgence is reading this whole situation appallingly wrong. Now, that is, in summary, the situation today, as I understand it, on the Ukrainian battlefronts. There's a lot more going on. So, briefly, there's been a flurry of articles, one by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times, a very extraordinary article in The Guardian about the Ilyushin 76 incident, the one in The Guardian, though essentially admitting that all the facts, all the known facts, appeared to support the Russian claim that the Ukrainians had shot down an Ilyushin 76 with 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war on board. The author of the article said that initially a Ukrainian source debunked this by claiming that the people who had been, the Russians, who the Russians said were killed, were still alive, but then another Ukrainian source came forward and said that the list that the Russians were providing was true. Anyway, Despite all of that, the article in The Guardian said that there still needed to be some kind of an investigation, an international investigation, because the Russians are compulsive liars. This could all be a disinformation exercise by the Russians, and we shouldn't believe what they say. Stephen Bryan, much more level-headed man at the Asia Times, also says that there should be an international investigation to establish what really happened over the course of this incident. And he has identified the various questions that the investigators should ask. What neither of these two people, Stephen Bryan and the commentator in The Guardian, appear willing to acknowledge is that though both the Russians and the Ukrainians, both Zelensky and Putin, have each called for an international investigation, there is no sign of one taking place, because there seems to be an almost complete lack of enthusiasm for such an investigation taking place in the West. And I say the West because though one could in theory cobble together an investigation, perhaps through the United Nations, involving, say, a non-aligned or Asian countries, I think it's likely that those countries would not be keen in participating in such an investigation without the participation of the West. So, for the moment, there is no investigation taking place. The West shows a complete lack of enthusiasm for this investigation. And the fact that it does increasingly look likely, the Russians say that it is beyond doubt, that the Ilyushin-76 was shot down with a Patriot missile, an early version, apparently, of the Patriot missile. Well, that perhaps explains why there are these doubts, why there is this unwillingness in the West to engage in an investigation, because, of course, if the investigation comes up with the wrong answers and starts pointing its fingers at Ukraine, well, that would be very embarrassing for the West, and they would rather not have it happen. So we are left with a situation where the Ilyushin-76 was shot down. Everybody accepts this. Where it is overwhelmingly likely that it was the Ukrainians who shot it down. They never properly denied that they did. Where it is overwhelmingly likely that it was shot down with a Patriot missile. Again, the evidence for that appears strong. That it is certain that the people who were killed were Ukrainian POWs, but where nobody, apart from the Russians and perhaps some people in Ukraine, want to establish the true facts. Now, I think in this case, it is so, there is so much information out there that one can say with, I think, a fair degree of confidence that this aircraft was shot down by the Ukrainians. What I am less sure about, even though Putin is increasingly coming round to this view, what I am less sure about is whether the shoot-down was intentional or was the result of a collapse in communications between Kiev and the operators of the Patriot missile battery. But that is something which an investigation would find out. But as I said, it's clear some people don't want to find out, and so we're never going to see that investigation happen. Anyway, no investigation of the Ilyushin-76 incident. There's not going to be an investigation of another incident either. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been lots of reports about a HIMARS missile strike on a bakery in Lysychansk. one of the major cities of Lugansk region, captured or liberated, as the Russians would say, by the Russians in the summer of 2022. And at least 28 people were killed in this attack on this bakery. And again, there's been the usual conflicting reports about this event. Again, not any real doubt, as far as I can see, that there was this attack on this bakery, that the people who were killed were actually killed, but rather arguments about what this bakery actually was doing. And the Russians say it was a civilian facility providing pastry products to the civilian population of Lysychansk. I don't know what the Ukrainians themselves have said, but I've seen reports circulating in the West that in fact this bakery was providing food products for the Russian military, that it was part, in other words, of the Russian army's commissariat system. I don't know, but what I will say again is that, of course, a independent investigation could establish the true facts quite quickly, but there is no prospect of it taking place. That's one. And secondly, that Ukraine has attacked civilian facilities on many occasions is hardly controversial, and I, for one, would have no difficulty believing that they simply launched a missile strike on Lysychansk because they knew the people would be going to this place and simply wanted to kill more people. I'm sorry to put it as simply as that. I'm not saying definitely that that is what happened, but if it was what happened, it would not surprise me. Anyway, there's been a lot more toing and froing about the financial situation. There is now a package which has been put together, I understand, by Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, providing $61 billion of funding for Ukraine, and which is to be presented to the Senate this week. I suspect that quite a few Republican senators will vote against. The Democrats have a majority in the Senate, and therefore it will pass. But I suspect that for the moment at least, Speaker Johnson and the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives will not support this. And Johnson has said that this package is dead on arrival when it reaches the House. Now, I think if that is true, if that is indeed what happens, if the Republicans vote this package down and make it clear that in its existing form it is unacceptable, then that will be the end of American funding for Ukraine. So this is now a high-stakes game. We'll see what happens over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. To repeat again, however, a point I have made before, even if funding on this scale is authorized, $61 billion, it is not going to change the situation on the battlefronts. There is not just a shortage of shells in Ukraine. There is a general shortage of shells and of production capacity to produce shells right across the West. A Ukrainian soldier has spoken to Forbes and has debunked the whole fantasy that FPV drones can somehow replace artillery. I'm not going to rehearse what I've said about this before, but this soldier also pointed out that FPV drones only have limited range, and I would add, by the way, that the drone operators themselves are very vulnerable and are relentlessly hunted by each side. And anyway, these drones pack a small explosive charge. They cannot do the sort of damage that artillery does. So $61 billion is simply going to throw more money at the problem. It is not going to change the situation on the battlefield. J.D. Vance has made the point that when the administration was fully funded and provided a huge amount of equipment to Ukraine for the offensive in 2023 against a weaker Russian adversary than Ukraine faces now, it didn't achieve victory. There is no reason to think that $61 billion is going to achieve victory this year or next year or at any point in time. Now, anyway, we shall see. It will be an important symbolic step if the United States, if the Congress refuses to authorize funding for Ukraine. And I suspect that deep down the Biden administration fears that that will indeed be the case, and that might be driving its renewed push to seize the frozen Russian assets, the latest scheme, which I discussed yesterday, being for the US government and G7 governments to issue bonds with the assets as collateral. And I've already explained that from my point of view, my perspective, that is even worse legally than simply seizing the assets themselves. A scheme like that merely highlights the fact that the assets belong to Russia. Anyway, on legal questions, there's now been a succession of legal decisions, legal rulings from the International Court of Justice connected to various claims that Ukraine has brought against Russia. These claims and these rulings, by the way, have received zero coverage, as far as I can see, in Britain. I don't know whether the situation is any better in the United States. I doubt it. But on point after point, the ICJ has simply rejected Ukrainian claims. There is a Ukrainian claim being brought against Russia under the Genocide Convention, as I understand it. The ICJ confirmed that it has jurisdiction to hear that case, but importantly, it ordered no interim measures, which makes me think that they don't actually believe that anything like that is really happening, because of course the case will go on for years, and if they really thought that something on that scale was taking place in the war, presumably they would have announced interim measures to try to stop it happening. On every other point, on the issue of the Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, about the funding of separatists in Donbass before the current fighting began, and whether that amounted to terrorism. In connection with all of these things, the ICJ failed to give the Ukrainians anything they wanted. So, a series of weak cases, all brought by Ukraine against Russia. And it's interesting to see that the ICJ, again, on these issues, has refused to join the various lawfare operations, which we have become so used to recently. I think all of these decisions were correct. So, there we are. Bad news for Ukraine from every front. A deepening reluctance in the United States to provide Ukraine with further funding. Reluctance reflected not just in the stance taken by Republican representatives in the House, and I suspect, as we will see, Republican senators in the Senate, but also reflecting the general mood across the United States. So, no word about negotiations. That remains a taboo word. I don't know to what extent Western governments really understand how bad the situation on the battle lines for Ukraine is becoming. The Forbes article I spoke about, which acknowledged again the ammunition crisis, conceded that Ukraine might have to give ground in a few places. The Institute for the Study of War basically seemed to do the same, but there doesn't seem to be an awareness so far that we are within perhaps visible distance of something much bigger, that if Ukraine doesn't have any ammunition to defend Kupiansk, for example, how are they going to defend the positions in Kharkiv if they have no ammunition to defend there either? But anyway, nobody wants to talk about these things. Nobody wants to negotiate. Everybody wants to keep the war going. There's going to be another conference in Switzerland now, looking based on trying to enlist support for Zelensky's peace formula, which the Russians have already rejected. I can't help but think that we're now in that strange, surreal situation where people in the West will be debating all these plans and schemes and arguing about Ukrainian funding, and where in Ukraine itself they'll be playing musical chairs right up to the moment when the whole thing collapses all around them. And then, well, we shall see. What about the situation in the Middle East? Now, yesterday I talked about the sterility, as far as I can see, of the American missile and bombing strikes in the Middle East, the ones that have been launched against targets in Iraq and Syria in response to the attack on Tower 22. We've now had more reports of more bomb and missile strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. The British, who have spent a huge amount of time over the last few years ridiculing the condition of Russia's one aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, talking about how it billows black smoke and all that sort of thing, have now been utterly humiliated by the fact that their two new carriers, Queen Elizabeth carriers, seem unable to participate in combat operations because they lack aircraft and pilots and have a host of unresolved mechanical issues. They seem to be in a worse state than the Kuznetsov was in before that ship was replaced by the Russians back into major refurbishment and repair. Just saying. But anyway, all of these attacks taking place in the Middle East. Some talk now that the United States might also back, alongside Britain, the announcement of a Palestinian state and a vote to that effect in the General Assembly, and perhaps even a ceasefire in Gaza. There are reports that Qatar has negotiated a ceasefire, a 45-day ceasefire in Gaza, conditional upon the release of hostages. The very latest reports I'm seeing suggest that Hamas has actually rejected this offer, that they're insisting that a long-term ceasefire is what is needed. I am not absolutely sure about this report. Anyway, there are reports about this, and that this is what the United States is trying to do in order to prevent escalation from continuing. Now, again, I want to make it clear that if the United States does take steps like this, I, for one, will not say that that is wrong. On the contrary, I would say that that was the better thing to do. But of course, and this is the thing to understand, if there is a ceasefire, even if it is only temporary but for an extended period, and if recognition of a Palestinian state happens, then in the Middle East and on the Palestinian territories, it will be seen as a victory by Hamas and by Iran. The view will be that Hamas has withstood this enormous Israeli attack. Its organization is still intact. I've seen one report that says that 80% of its tunnels are also still intact. They've been able to infiltrate back into northern Gaza. There's some reports to this effect. And certainly the organization still exists, and its military arm also still exists. So it will have withstood the Israeli attack, and it will have leveraged the situation to enable Palestine to achieve recognition as a state. It's difficult to see how that would not be seen by Palestinians as to a very great extent vindicating Hamas's actions and conduct. And given the way in which Israel and the United States have sought to portray Hamas as a cat's paw of Iran's, it's likely that Iran's prestige would also grow. By contrast, it's impossible for me to see how Israel, the present Israeli government, could fail to see such an outcome as a clear-cut defeat for Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu has always opposed the setting up of a Palestinian state. He has consistently obstructed every move that has attempted to achieve it over the course of his long career. And having such a thing happen a few weeks after Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October would be a personal disaster for him if it was not only voted for by the General Assembly, but backed by the United States. So Israelis would see it as a victory for Hamas and by extension for Iran, and as a defeat for themselves, and some of them would probably start to see it as a sign of a betrayal by the United States as well. Now, because of all of this, I am not convinced that any of this is going to happen. I'm just saying, I hope in some ways that it does. I certainly think there should be a Palestinian state recognized, and I think that that state should be encouraged thereafter to seek negotiations with Israel, and Israel should be encouraged to seek negotiations with that state. But I'm not the person making the decisions. And if we look at the stance that the Israeli government has been taking, not just recently, but over many years now, and if we also look at general opinion in the Middle East, and if we also think about US policy towards Israel, the Palestinians, and the Middle East, they will see this as a defeat, and to a certain extent they will be right, and for that reason I think that at some point the opposition will be sufficiently strong to sink this plan, if it even exists. So, just saying, the reality is we may be talking about plans like this, but bombing and missile strikes across the Middle East are still taking place. US officials are saying that this is only the start and more is to come. And of course, the more bombing and missile strikes and attacks there are, and the more ineffectual they are seen to be, which, by the way, automatically follows, the greater the pressure, again, to launch that strike on Iran. That, it seems to me, is the current reality. Perhaps these plans that I was talking about will bear some fruition, in which case, of course, the situation will change. But I am skeptical, and in the meantime, what I see is fighting going on, missile strikes and bombing strikes going on, and that is taking us ever closer to that confrontation with Iran, which both the US and Iranian governments say they don't want. Anyway, this is where I finished my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.